The gunshots had finally ceased, but the acrid scent of gunpowder and blood still lingered in the air as Forrest Xanders rode through the decimated remains of what had once been a peaceful settlement on the outskirts of Silver Springs, Colorado. The year was 1873, and the territory was still wild and untamed, a place where law was often just a distant concept rather than a reality. Forrest pulled back on the reins of his dun-colored stallion, surveying the carnage with a grim expression. The raid had been brutal and thorough, charred buildings still smoldering, bodies scattered like abandoned ragdolls across the dusty Main Street. He'd been tracking the band of outlaws responsible for nearly a week, following a trail of destruction that stretched back through 3 counties. Always a day behind, always finding only the aftermath. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ravaged town as Forrest dismounted, his spurs jingling softly against the silence. His weathered hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip, a habit born from years riding the dangerous trails of the West. "Too late again," he muttered to himself, his deep voice barely above a whisper. He moved methodically through the destruction, checking for survivors, though experience told him he'd find none. The Blackwell Gang, no relation to the notorious outlaw family from Texas, had developed a reputation for leaving no witnesses. As he approached what remained of a small homestead at the edge of the settlement, a barely perceptible sound caught his attention. Forrest froze, listening intently. There it was again, a soft, pained moan coming from behind the overturned wagon near the burned-out shell of the house. His gun drawn, Forrest approached cautiously. Years of surviving in these territories had taught him that even sounds of distress could be a trap. As he rounded the wagon, he found a woman lying in the dirt, her dress torn and bloodied. Her auburn hair was matted with blood from a wound on her temple, and another wound in her side had soaked her clothing in crimson. Holstering his weapon, Forrest knelt beside her. Her eyes were closed, face pale as the moon now rising in the evening sky, but as he placed 2 fingers against her throat, he felt the faint, persistent flutter of a pulse. "You're still breathing," he said softly, surprise evident in his voice. "That's enough." The woman's eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of a stormy sky. They focused on him for just a moment before closing again. Forrest knew he couldn't leave her. Silver Springs was more than a day's ride away, and she wouldn't survive without immediate care. With gentle but efficient movements, he tore strips from his spare shirt to bind her wounds as best he could, then carefully lifted her onto his horse. Mounting behind her, he cradled her unconscious form against his chest and turned his horse toward his cabin in the foothills, the only chance this woman had for survival. The moon illuminated their path as Forrest urged his horse forward, aware that each passing minute might be bringing the woman closer to death. Yet something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a very long time, refused to accept that possibility. He didn't know her name or her story, but he was determined that her life wouldn't end today, not if he had anything to say about it. The night air grew colder as they climbed higher into the foothills, and Forrest wrapped his coat around the unconscious woman. His cabin was still hours away, but he pushed onward, his stallion sensing the urgency and maintaining a steady pace despite the difficult terrain. "Hold on," Forrest whispered, uncertain if she could hear him. "Just hold on." The woman stirred slightly in his arms, a soft moan escaping her lips. It was the only sign of life she'd shown since he'd found her, and it fueled his determination. Whoever she was, whatever her story, she was a fighter, and Forrest Xanders had always respected fighters. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Forrest's cabin finally came into view, a solid structure of rough-hewn logs nestled against the protective embrace of a rocky outcropping. It wasn't much, but it was sturdy and secure, the home he'd built with his own hands after leaving his life as a lawman behind. He dismounted carefully, keeping the woman cradled against him, and carried her inside. Laying her gently on his bed, Forrest worked quickly to light a lamp and stoke the embers in the fireplace back to life. In the improved light, he could better assess her injuries. The head wound looked worse than it actually was. Scalp injuries always bled profusely. The wound in her side was more concerning. It appeared to be a bullet graze, deep enough to be serious but not immediately fatal. Infection was the real danger now. Forrest gathered his limited medical supplies: alcohol, clean cloths, a needle and thread, and herbs he'd learned to use from an old medicine woman who'd once saved his life. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He cleaned the wounds carefully, his large, calloused hands moving with surprising gentleness. When he began stitching the side wound, the woman's eyes flew open, a strangled cry escaping her lips as she tried to pull away. "Easy now," Forrest said, his voice low and steady. "I'm trying to help you." Her eyes, wide with fear and pain, darted around the unfamiliar surroundings before settling on his face. "Who?" she began, but her voice was barely audible. "Name's Forrest Xanders," he replied, continuing his work despite her flinching. "Found you after the raid. You're safe now." She tried to speak again, but instead lapsed back into unconsciousness, her body mercifully sparing her the pain of his ministrations. When he finished tending her wounds, Forrest carefully cleaned the dirt and blood from her face with a damp cloth. Without the grime of violence, he could see she was young, perhaps mid-20s, with delicate features that belied the strength it had taken to survive her ordeal. Exhausted from the long ride and the intensity of the past hours, Forrest settled into a chair beside the bed, determined to keep watch over his unexpected guest. Questions swirled in his mind. Who was she? What had she been doing in that settlement? Did she have family who would be looking for her? But they would have to wait. For now, it was enough that she was breathing. 3 days passed with the woman drifting in and out of consciousness. When fever took hold on the second night, Forrest feared he might lose her after all. He worked tirelessly, applying cool cloths to her forehead and brewing herbal teas that he carefully helped her swallow. He spoke to her during these moments, his voice a constant companion through her delirium, though he doubted she would remember any of it. It was dawn on the 4th day when she finally opened her eyes with true awareness, the fever having broken during the night. Forrest had just returned from tending to his horse when he noticed her watching him from the bed. "You're awake," he said, setting down the bucket of water he'd carried in. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse but stronger than before. "My cabin. About a day's ride from where I found you." Forrest poured a cup of water and brought it to her. "Can you tell me your name?" She accepted the water gratefully, taking small sips before answering. "Rebecca. Rebecca Foster." "You're from Silver Springs?" She shook her head slightly, wincing at the movement. "No, I was traveling with a group heading to Empire City. We stopped at that settlement to trade and rest for a few days." Her eyes clouded with remembered horror. "They came at dawn, so many of them. They wanted everything we had." "The Blackwell Gang," Forrest confirmed grimly. "They've been terrorizing the territory for months." "They killed everyone," Rebecca whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I tried to hide, but one of them found me. He shot me and left me for dead behind that wagon." Forrest nodded, not pressing for more details. He'd seen enough of the gang's handiwork to fill in the blanks. "You need more rest, Miss Foster. We can talk more when you're stronger." "Please," she said, her hand reaching out to grasp his wrist with surprising strength. "Call me Rebecca. And Thank you for saving my life." Something in her direct gaze, the sincerity in her voice, made Forrest uncomfortable in a way gunfights and danger never had. He nodded curtly and gently extracted his wrist from her grasp. "There's food when you're ready." Nothing fancy, just beans and some dried venison. Rebecca's lips curved into a small smile. After nearly dying, beans sound wonderful. For the next week, Rebecca grew stronger each day. The wound on her head healed quickly, though it would leave a small scar at her temple. The side injury was slower to mend, but showed no signs of infection. Forrest maintained a respectful distance, providing her with privacy as much as his modest cabin would allow, sleeping on a bedroll near the fireplace while she occupied his bed. During the long evenings, they began to share their stories. Rebecca told him of her life in St. Louis, where she'd worked as a schoolteacher until her parents' deaths 6 months earlier. With nothing holding her there, she decided to join her cousin in Empire City, Colorado, where teachers were desperately needed for the growing population of children. "What about you?" she asked one evening as they sat before the fire, the autumn chill making the warmth welcome. "Have you always lived alone up here?" Forrest stared into the flames, his face half in shadow. "No, was a deputy marshal for 7 years, based out of Denver." Rebecca waited for him to continue, sensing there was more to the story. When he remained silent, she gently prompted, "What made you leave that life behind?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. "Failed to protect someone I was sworn to keep safe," he said finally. "A witness against the Blackwell Gang, as it happens. 3 years ago." Rebecca's eyes widened. "That's why you were tracking them." It wasn't a question, but Forrest nodded anyway. "Been on their trail whenever I can." "Not officially anymore, but—" He shrugged. "Some debts need paying. And you live up here alone all the time, mostly. Go into town for supplies every few weeks. Work as a hunting guide for Easterners sometimes when I need the money." Rebecca studied him in the firelight. His face was weathered from years in the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke more of hardship than laughter. Yet there was a gentleness to him that contradicted his rough exterior, evident in the way he'd cared for her, in the way he spoke in that low, measured voice. "It must be lonely," she said softly. Forrest's eyes met hers for a brief moment before returning to the fire. "Got used to it." But something in his tone made Rebecca wonder if that was entirely true. As the days passed and Rebecca's strength returned, she began to help around the cabin, first with small tasks like preparing meals, then gradually taking on more responsibilities. Forrest initially protested, insisting she needed to rest, but Rebecca was determined not to be a burden. "I've been idle long enough," she declared on the morning of her second week at the cabin. "Besides, keeping busy helps me not to think about what happened." Forrest understood that need all too well, so he didn't argue further. He found himself increasingly aware of the changes her presence brought to his solitary existence. The cabin seemed warmer somehow, and not just from the fire that was kept burning more consistently. Meals were no longer just a necessity, but a time for conversation. Even the silence that often fell between them felt companionable rather than empty. It was during one such comfortable silence, as they sat on the small porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and crimson, that Rebecca broached the subject of her departure. "I should try to reach Empire City soon," she said, though there was a hesitancy in her voice that hadn't been there before. "My cousin will be worried when I don't arrive with the others." Forrest nodded, ignoring the unexpected pang her words caused. "Your wounds are healing well. Another week, maybe, and you should be fit for travel. I'll take you to Silver Springs. It's the nearest town with a stagecoach to Empire City. You don't have to do that. You've already done so much. It's a 2-day journey at least, not letting you make it alone." Rebecca smiled, touched by his protectiveness. "Thank you." The week that followed held a strange tension, as if time was simultaneously moving too quickly and not quickly enough. Forrest found excuses to delay their departure, a storm threatening in the mountains, a report from a passing trapper about outlaw activity on the main trail, and Rebecca didn't challenge these reasons, seeming equally reluctant to leave. On what was to be their final evening at the cabin, Forrest returned from hunting with a young deer slung over his shoulders. It was more meat than they needed for one meal, but he'd been determined to provide something better than beans and hardtack for their last dinner together. Rebecca looked up from where she was mending one of his shirts, a domestic scene that made something twist inside Forrest's chest. "That's quite a successful hunt," she observed with a smile. "Thought we deserved a proper meal," he replied, carrying the deer to the small shed where he dressed his kills. When he returned to the cabin later, the meat properly prepared, he found Rebecca had set the table with the cabin's mismatched plates and cups, even placing a small bunch of late wildflowers in a jar at the center. "I found these growing near the stream," she explained, noticing his surprised expression. "I thought they might brighten things up." The simple gesture affected Forrest more deeply than he would have expected. How long had it been since anyone had thought to brighten things up for him? As they ate the venison stew Rebecca had prepared, Forrest found himself studying her face in the lamplight. The bruising had faded, and color had returned to her cheeks. Her auburn hair, now clean and brushed, fell in soft waves past her shoulders. But it was the quiet strength in her gray eyes that continually drew his gaze. "What will you do?" Rebecca asked suddenly. "After you take me to Silver Springs, I mean." Forrest considered the question. "Same as always, I suppose, hunting, tracking, surviving, and the Blackwell Gang." "Won't stop until they're brought to justice." Rebecca set down her spoon. "It's dangerous going after them alone." "Been doing it 3 years, Forrest replied with a slight shrug. "That doesn't make it less dangerous. It makes you lucky." Her concern was evident in her voice, or very skilled. "Bit of both, maybe. Have you ever considered?" Rebecca hesitated, then continued that there might be other ways to live, other things worth pursuing. Forrest's brow furrowed. "Like what? A home, family, connections with people who care about you." "Had those things once," Forrest said quietly. "Learned the hard way they are not for men like me." Rebecca's eyes softened. "What happened?" For a long moment, Forrest was silent, debating whether to share the burden he'd carried alone for so long. Finally, the words came, halting at first, then flowing more freely. "Was married. Anna. Met her in Denver when I was first appointed deputy marshal. She was a seamstress, beautiful, kind." His voice grew distant with memory. "Had a little house on the edge of town. Were expecting our first child when it happened." Rebecca's hand moved across the table to rest lightly on his. "The witness you mentioned," Forrest nodded. "James Thornton, former member of the Blackwell Gang who agreed to testify. I was assigned to protect him until the trial. Brought him to our house, thinking it would be safer than keeping him in town where everyone would know." He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the cabin walls. "They found us anyway, came in the night. I killed 2 of them, but there were more. They shot Thornton and Anna. She tried to run. They shot her in the back." Rebecca's grip on his hand tightened. "Forrest, I'm so sorry." "She lived long enough to reach the doctors," he continued, his voice hollow. "But the baby came too early. Neither of them survived the night." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of his confession. Rebecca's eyes shone with tears, her heart aching for the man before her who had lost everything because of his sense of duty. "Is that why you left the marshal service?" she asked softly. Forrest nodded. "Couldn't wear the badge after that. Failed at the one thing that mattered most." He finally met her gaze. "So you see, Rebecca, men like me don't get second chances at those things. Some debts can never be repaid." "I don't believe that," she said with quiet conviction. "What happened wasn't your fault. You were doing your job trying to bring dangerous men to justice. Doesn't change the outcome." "No, it doesn't," Rebecca agreed. "But carrying this guilt, isolating yourself, it doesn't honor their memory either." Forrest withdrew his hand from hers, his expression closing off. "It's getting late. We should turn in if we're to make an early start tomorrow." Rebecca recognized his retreat and didn't push further. "Of course. Thank you for sharing your story with me, Forrest. I know it wasn't easy." Later, as she lay in the bed that had become familiar over the past weeks, Rebecca listened to Forrest's movements as he settled onto his bedroll near the dying fire. Her heart ached for all he had lost, for the walls he had built around himself as protection against further pain. And yet, in the short time she had known him, she had seen glimpses of the man beneath that armor, a man of honor and unexpected gentleness, of quiet strength and profound loyalty. A man, she realized with a start, she had come to care for deeply. The thought both exhilarated and frightened her. Tomorrow they would leave this cabin, this isolated place where time had seemed suspended, and return to the real world with all its complications and dangers. And after Silver Springs, their paths would diverge, she to her new life in Empire City, he back to his solitary existence and dangerous quest. Unless Rebecca turned the possibility over in her mind until sleep finally claimed her, dreams filled with uncertain futures and paths not yet chosen. Morning came cold and clear, the mountains sharp against the pale blue sky. They prepared for the journey in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Forrest packed provisions and checked his weapons, while Rebecca gathered the few possessions she had, her torn and mended dress, a small locket containing miniatures of her parents that had miraculously survived the raid, and a journal Forrest had given her from his meager collection of books. As Forrest saddled his horse, Rebecca took one last look at the cabin that had been her sanctuary. Despite its simplicity, it had come to feel like a home in a way her lodgings in St. Louis never had after her parents' passing. "Ready?" Forrest asked, leading the saddled horse to where she stood. Rebecca nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotions swirling within her. Forrest helped her mount, then swung up behind her, his arms encircling her waist as he took the reins. The closeness was both comforting and unsettling, making her acutely aware of him in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be during her recovery. They rode in silence for the first few hours, the trail winding down from the foothills toward the more traveled routes that would eventually lead to Silver Springs. The day warmed as the sun climbed higher, and the tension between them seemed to ease somewhat as they fell into the rhythm of the journey. When they stopped at midday to rest the horse and eat a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Rebecca finally voiced the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Have you ever thought of returning to law enforcement? Officially, I mean." Forrest looked surprised by the question. "No. Those days are behind me. But you're still pursuing justice in your own way. The skills and knowledge you have could be valuable to a growing town like Empire City." His eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you suggesting, Rebecca?" "I've heard my cousin mention in her letters that Empire City is growing rapidly but struggles to maintain order. They need good men with experience." She met his gaze directly. "Men like you. I work alone now. And how has that served you these past 3 years?" Are you any closer to bringing the Blackwell Gang to justice? When he didn't respond, she continued more gently. I'm not saying you should give up your quest, just that there might be a better way to achieve it with resources, support, maybe even deputies of your own. Forrest stood abruptly, walking a few paces away to stare out at the distant mountains. Rebecca waited, giving him space to process her words. Why do you care what I do? He finally asked, his back still turned to her. Rebecca rose and moved to stand beside him, her heart pounding with the risk she was about to take. Because in the short time I've known you, Forrest Xanders, I've seen a man of extraordinary courage and compassion, a man who deserves more than a life of solitude and endless pursuit. She took a deep breath. And because I find myself not wanting our paths to diverge at Silver Springs. Forrest turned to look at her then, his expression a complex mixture of surprise, doubt, and something else, something that made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat. You don't know what you're saying, he said hoarsely. You've been through a trauma. It's natural to feel attached to the person who saved you. Do you really think so little of me? Rebecca challenged, a flash of anger in her gray eyes. That I don't know my own mind. That I'm so fragile I would mistake gratitude for deeper feelings. I think you're one of the strongest women I've ever met, Forrest countered. But that doesn't change the facts. I'm a broken man, Rebecca. I couldn't protect my wife and child. I've spent 3 years hunting outlaws with nothing to show for it but more scars. What could I possibly offer you? A partnership, she replied without hesitation. A chance for both of us to build something new from the ashes of what we've lost. Her voice softened. I'm not asking for promises or declarations, Forrest. Just an open mind to possibilities beyond what you've allowed yourself to imagine. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, as if trying to read the truth in her eyes. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. I'll think about it, he said quietly. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a rejection either. For now, it was enough. They resumed their journey, the conversation shifting to lighter topics as they rode through the afternoon. By evening, they had reached a small way station where travelers could pay for a meal, a place to sleep, and fresh horses if needed. The proprietor, a gruff older man named Jenkins, recognized Forrest immediately. Xanders, been months since you passed through. Thought maybe the mountains had finally claimed you. Takes more than mountains to do that, Forrest replied with the ghost of a smile. Need lodging for the night. 2 rooms. Jenkins glanced between Forrest and Rebecca with undisguised curiosity. Only got 1 room available. Big group came through yesterday, heading for the mines near Empire City. Forrest frowned. We'll make camp outside then. Don't be foolish, Jenkins said. Storm brewing, feel it in my bones. Rooms big enough, got 2 beds, unless the lady objects. Rebecca quickly shook her head. I have no objections, Mr. Jenkins. We'll take the room, thank you. After a hot meal that was a welcome change from trail rations, they retired to the promised room. It was simple but clean, with 2 narrow beds separated by a small table, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and a single window overlooking the station yard. I can sleep on the floor, Forrest offered as he set their few belongings on the table. Don't be ridiculous, Rebecca replied, moving to the washstand to splash cool water on her face. You've slept on a bedroll for weeks because of me. The beds are perfectly adequate, and we're both adults. The situation nevertheless created an intimacy neither had anticipated. As they prepared for sleep, there was a heightened awareness between them, a careful politeness that hadn't been necessary in the more clearly defined roles of patient and caretaker. Rebecca settled into one of the beds, listening to the sound of Forrest removing his boots and gun belt. Through the window, she could see dark clouds gathering, confirming Jenkins' weather prediction. Jenkins mentioned people heading to Empire City, she said, breaking the silence. Miners, he said. Gold was discovered there last year, Forrest replied, stretching out on the other bed. Town's grown faster than anyone expected. Brings opportunity, but trouble too. All the more reason they need good law enforcement. Forrest gave a non-committal grunt, but Rebecca could tell he was considering her earlier words more seriously than he had let on. Outside, the first rumbles of thunder sounded in the distance. Soon, rain began to patter against the window, gradually increasing to a steady downpour. The storm seemed to isolate their small room from the rest of the world, creating a private space where truths could be spoken. "I'm afraid," Rebecca admitted into the darkness between their beds. "Of the storm?" Forrest asked. "Of reaching Empire City and finding it's not what I hoped for. Of starting over again among strangers." She paused. "Of never seeing you again after Silver Springs." There was a long silence, broken only by the drumming of rain and occasional rumbles of thunder. Rebecca began to think Forrest had fallen asleep or chosen not to respond when his deep voice finally came through the darkness. "Been alone so long, I forgot what it was like to have someone care where I went or what happened to me." The simple honesty of his words made Rebecca's heart ache. "And how does it feel remembering?" "Terrifying," he admitted. "And, I don't know, like something long frozen starting to thaw." Rebecca smiled into the darkness, hope blooming in her chest. "That's a start, I suppose." Another long pause then. "I keep thinking about what you said, about Empire City needing lawmen. And I'm wondering if maybe it's time to stop hunting shadows on my own. If maybe there's a different path to the justice I've been seeking." Rebecca resisted the urge to press further, sensing that Forrest needed to come to his own conclusions in his own time. "Whatever you decide, I believe in you, Forrest Xanders." The storm continued through the night, but inside the small room, something had shifted between them, a tentative bridge spanning the chasm of their separate pasts toward a possible shared future. They reached Silver Springs late the following afternoon, the town buzzing with the usual activity of a supply center for the surrounding mining communities and ranches. Rebecca felt strangely exposed after weeks in the isolation of Forrest's cabin and the wilderness, the noise and bustle of the town overwhelming her senses. Forrest led them directly to the marshal's office, a sturdy building on the main street. Marshal Jim Lawson, a barrel-chested man with a thick gray mustache, greeted Forrest with obvious respect. "Xanders, good to see you, son. What brings you down from your mountain?" Forrest quickly explained the situation, omitting certain details, but making it clear that Rebecca was a survivor of the Blackwell Gang's latest atrocity. Lawson's expression grew grim as he listened. "Damn those bastards," he muttered. "Been causing havoc all over the territory. Had word they hit a settlement east of here, but didn't know there was a survivor." He turned to Rebecca. "You're a lucky woman, Miss Foster, both to have survived and to have been found by Xanders here." "I'm well aware of that, Marshal," Rebecca replied with a small smile. "Miss Foster needs to reach Empire City," Forrest said. "Her cousin's expecting her." Lawson nodded. "Stage leaves day after tomorrow. Not much I can do about that schedule, I'm afraid. You're welcome to stay at my wife's boarding house until then. She always keeps a room ready for travelers." "Thank you, Marshal," Rebecca said. "That's very kind." "Before we go," Forrest interjected, "any word on the Blackwell Gang's current whereabouts?" Lawson's expression turned thoughtful. "As a matter of fact, yes. Had a telegram from the marshal over in Empire City just yesterday. Says they got word the gang might be planning something. Their bank's been bringing in money for the mine payrolls." Forrest's posture stiffened. "Empire City, you say?" "That's right. "Marshal, there's a good man, but new to the job and short-handed. Asked if I could spare any deputies." Lawson shook his head. "Wish I could help him, but I'm stretched thin as it is." Rebecca and Forrest exchanged a look, the coincidence too significant to ignore. "What's the marshal's name in Empire City?" Forrest asked. "William Parker. Know him?" "No, but I think it's time I made his acquaintance." Lawson raised an eyebrow. "You offering to help, Xanders? Thought you were done with badges." "Not offering to wear one," Forrest clarified. "Just sharing information. I've been tracking the Blackwell Gang longer than most." "Well, I'm sure Parker would appreciate whatever insight you can provide." Lawson studied Forrest for a moment. "Stage to Empire City it is, then. For both of you." Forrest glanced at Rebecca, a question in his eyes. She nodded almost imperceptibly, her heart racing with the implications. "Yes," Forrest confirmed. "Both of us." Mrs. Lawson's boarding house proved to be a comfortable establishment with clean rooms and excellent home-cooked meals. Rebecca was given a small but pleasant room at the front of the house, while Forrest took a room at the back, preferring its proximity to the stables in case a quick departure became necessary, old habits dying hard. The day before their departure for Empire City, Rebecca found herself alone in the small parlor of the boarding house, writing in the journal Forrest had given her. The events of the past weeks seemed almost dreamlike when committed to paper, yet the emotions they had stirred in her were undeniably real. She looked up at the sound of footsteps to find Forrest standing in the doorway, his expression uncharacteristically uncertain. "May I join you?" he asked. Rebecca smiled and gestured to the chair opposite hers. "Of course." Forrest sat, his large frame making the delicate parlor furniture seem even more diminutive. He held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly as if gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking about what happens when we reach Empire City," he finally said. Rebecca set aside her journal. And I think you were right, about there being other ways to pursue justice, about—" he hesitated, "about possibilities." Hope flared in Rebecca's chest, but she kept her expression composed. "What sort of possibilities?" "I spoke with Marshal Lawson again this morning. He's agreed to write a letter of recommendation to Marshal Parker. Said a man with my experience would be an asset to Empire City." "You're considering becoming a lawman again?" Rebecca couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Forrest nodded. "Deputy Marshal, at least to start, if Parker will have me." "What changed your mind?" His eyes met hers directly. "You did. What you said about building something new from the ashes." He set his hat aside and leaned forward slightly. "I can't promise anything, Rebecca. I'm still carrying ghosts that may never fully rest, but I'm willing to try. If you're willing to be patient with a man who's forgotten how to do anything but hunt and survive." Rebecca felt tears prickling behind her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I think patience is a virtue I can manage, especially for the right cause." A small smile, rare and precious, curved Forrest's lips. "Then I suppose we'll see what Empire City has to offer us both." The stagecoach journey to Empire City took 2 grueling days, the road rough, and the coach crowded with miners, merchants, and a few women traveling to join husbands or take up positions as teachers or seamstresses. Despite the discomfort, Rebecca found herself enjoying the anticipation of arrival, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Forrest remained vigilant throughout the journey, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, his hand never far from his gun. The possibility that the Blackwell Gang might be targeting Empire City had sharpened his focus. But there was something else driving him now, a protective instinct that went beyond his general sense of duty. When the coach finally crested the last hill before Empire City, the sight took Rebecca's breath away. Nestled in a valley with mountains rising dramatically behind it, the town was larger than she had expected, with solid wooden buildings lining wide streets and the glint of new construction visible on the outskirts. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "And growing fast," Forrest observed. "Towns like this attract all sorts good and bad." As the coach rattled down the main street toward the stage depot, Rebecca tried to absorb every detail, from the bustling general store to the impressive new bank building, from the schoolhouse on one end of town to the inevitable saloons clustered at the other. When they finally disembarked, stiff and weary from the journey, Rebecca immediately began looking for her cousin among the crowd gathered to meet the stage. "Rebecca! Rebecca Foster!" a female voice called. A woman about Rebecca's age with blonde hair and familiar features pushed through the crowd, her face alight with relief and joy. "Oh my goodness, it is you, we thought, when we heard about the attack." She threw her arms around Rebecca in an emotional embrace. "Thank God you're alive." "Hello, Sarah," Rebecca said, returning the hug with equal fervor. "It's so good to see you." Sarah pulled back, holding Rebecca at arm's length to look her over. "When you didn't arrive with the others and then word came about the raid, we feared the worst. How did you survive?" Rebecca turned to where Forrest stood a few paces behind her, his tall figure drawing Sarah's curious gaze. "Because of this man, Forrest Xanders. He found me after the raid and saved my life." Sarah's eyes widened as she took in Forrest's weathered appearance and the gun at his hip. "Then I owe you a debt I can never repay, Mr. Xanders," she said sincerely. "Rebecca is the only family I have left." Forrest nodded awkwardly, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Just did what anyone would do, madam." "Not anyone," Rebecca corrected softly. "Sarah, Forrest is here to speak with Marshal Parker. He has information about the men who attacked our group, the Blackwell Gang." Sarah's expression grew serious. "Then you should go directly to the marshal's office. There's been talk of trouble brewing. The mine payroll arrived yesterday and everyone's on edge." She turned back to Rebecca. "I'll take your things to our house and prepare a proper welcome for you both for dinner." "Both?" Rebecca questioned. "Of course. I insist that Mr. Xanders join us after all he's done." Sarah's tone brooked no argument. "The marshal's office is just down the street past the bank. You can't miss it." With a promise to meet later, Rebecca and Forrest headed toward the marshal's office, both acutely aware that their arrival in Empire City marked a turning point. Whatever happened next would set the course for their futures, individually, and perhaps, though neither dared say it aloud together. Marshal William Parker proved to be younger than expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with sharp blue eyes and an air of competence that belied his relative youth. He read Marshal Lawson's letter of introduction with interest before fixing his gaze on Forrest. "Says here you were a deputy marshal out of Denver for 7 years. Good record. Commendations for bravery." Parker set the letter down. "Also says you've been tracking the Blackwell Gang independently for the past 3 years. Mind if I ask why?" Forrest briefly explained his history with the gang, omitting personal details, but making it clear that his knowledge of their methods was extensive. Parker nodded thoughtfully. "And you're interested in a deputy position here in Empire City, if you're offering." "I'm short-handed and facing a potential threat from the most notorious gang in the territory. I'd be a fool not to hire someone with your experience." Parker extended his hand. "The job's yours if you want it, Deputy Xanders." As they shook hands, Rebecca felt a surge of pride and hope. This was the new beginning they had both been seeking, though in very different ways. "Miss Foster," Parker continued, turning to Rebecca, "Lawson mentioned you're a survivor of the gang's most recent attack. Anything you can tell us about what you saw might help us prepare." Rebecca recounted the details of the raid as clearly as she could, though the memories were still painful. When she finished, Parker's expression was grim, matches their usual pattern, quick, ruthless, well-organized. He looked at Forrest. "Any idea when they might make their move here?" "Soon," Forrest replied with certainty. "They won't wait long after the payroll arrives. Probably scouting the town now, looking for weaknesses." Parker stood, decision made. "Then we'd better get you sworn in and start preparing. I've got 2 other deputies, good men but inexperienced with this level of threat." As Parker administered the oath of office and pinned a deputy's badge to Forrest's vest, Rebecca watched the transformation in him. There was a straightening of his shoulders, a certainty in his stance that spoke of returning to a role that, despite its painful associations, still fit him well. When the ceremony was complete, Parker outlined his immediate concerns and plans, with Forrest offering tactical suggestions based on his knowledge of the gang's methods. Rebecca listened with growing anxiety, the reality of the danger they faced becoming increasingly clear. "You should go to your cousin's house now," Forrest told her when there was a pause in the planning. "Stay there until this is over." "I will," Rebecca promised, "but I expect to see both of you at dinner tonight. Sarah will be disappointed otherwise." Parker raised an eyebrow at this exchange, but made no comment beyond agreeing to join them if circumstances permitted. Sarah's home, a modest but well-maintained house near the schoolhouse where she taught, was warm and welcoming. She embraced Rebecca again upon her arrival, then insisted on hearing the full story of her rescue and recovery. "It's like something from a novel," Sarah marveled when Rebecca finished her tale. "This Mr. Xanders sounds quite extraordinary." "He is," Rebecca agreed simply. Sarah gave her a knowing look. "And I suspect your feelings for him go beyond mere gratitude." Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. "Is it that obvious? Only to someone who knows you well." Sarah smiled. "And does he return these feelings?" "I think so, in his way." Rebecca sighed. "He's been through so much, Sarah, lost so much. It's not simple for him." "The best things rarely are simple," Sarah replied wisely. "Now, let's prepare for dinner. If we're to impress 2 lawmen this evening, we should make an effort." The dinner that evening was a success, despite the underlying tension of the town situation. Marshal Parker proved to be good company, his seriousness balanced by a dry wit that emerged as the meal progressed. Forrest was quieter, as was his nature, but Rebecca noticed him watching her throughout the evening, his eyes softening whenever their gazes met. After dinner, as Sarah and Parker engaged in a lively discussion about the town's need for educational improvements, Forrest drew Rebecca aside to the small porch at the back of the house. "Parker's arranged temporary lodgings for me at the boarding house near the marshal's office," he told her. "Convenient for keeping watch on the bank." Rebecca nodded, understanding the practicality of the arrangement while wishing for a different circumstance. "When do you think they'll make their move?" "Soon. Next few days at most." His expression grew serious. "Rebecca, I need you to promise me something." "What is it?" "If there's trouble, gunfire, commotion, anything that suggests the gang is making their move, you stay inside. Lock the doors. Get away from windows." His voice took on an intensity that revealed his concern. "These men don't leave witnesses. They've already tried to kill you once." "I promise," Rebecca said, touched by his protective instinct. "But you must promise me something in return." Forrest raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Promise me you'll be careful, that you won't take unnecessary risks." She held his gaze steadily. "I didn't survive a raid and a near-fatal injury only to lose you just when we're beginning to explore what might be between us." Something in her words seemed to strike Forrest deeply. He reached out, his calloused hand gently cupping her cheek in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "I promise," he said softly. Then, with a glance toward the house to ensure their privacy, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was both gentle and fiercely possessive. When they parted, Rebecca felt dizzy with emotion, her heart racing as if she'd run a great distance. Forrest looked similarly affected, his usually stoic expression transformed by wonder and desire. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "Early start tomorrow." Rebecca nodded, not trusting her voice. As she watched him walk away into the gathering darkness, she felt a curious mixture of joy and apprehension. Their journey together had taken an undeniable step forward, but the shadow of the Blackwell Gang still loomed large, threatening the future they had just begun to imagine. The next 2 days passed in a blur of anticipation and preparation. Forrest threw himself into his duties with characteristic thoroughness, working closely with Parker and the other deputies to secure the bank and develop strategies for dealing with the expected raid. Rebecca, meanwhile, spent time with Sarah, helping at the schoolhouse and becoming acquainted with her new community. Despite the circumstances, Rebecca found herself falling in love with Empire City. The town had a vibrant energy, its residents a diverse mix of pioneering spirits drawn by the promise of the West. Many were families with children, giving the community a stability that mining towns often lacked. She could easily imagine building a life here, teaching alongside Sarah, establishing a home, perhaps someday raising children of her own, children with Forrest's dark hair and steady gaze. Such thoughts were premature, she knew, yet they persisted, especially in the quiet moments before sleep claimed her each night. Their brief but powerful kiss had confirmed what her heart already knew. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wanted to face them with Forrest Xanders at her side. On the evening of the 3rd day after their arrival, Rebecca was helping Sarah prepare dinner when a sharp knock came at the front door. Sarah answered it to find Marshal Parker standing on the porch, his expression grave. "Evening, ladies," he said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Sorry to interrupt your dinner preparations." "Not at all, Marshal," Sarah replied. "Is something wrong?" Parker's eyes went to Rebecca. "Got word from one of our scouts. Riders matching the description of the Blackwell Gang were spotted about 10 miles outside of town. We expect they'll make their move tomorrow." Rebecca's hand went to her throat. "All of them, appears to be, at least 8 men. Parker's jaw tightened. "Forrest asked me to come tell you personally. He wanted to make sure you remembered your promise to stay inside when trouble starts." "I remember," Rebecca assured him. "Please tell him to be careful." Parker nodded. "I've told the same to all my men. We're as prepared as we can be, thanks in large part to Forrest's experience with this gang. With any luck, we'll put an end to their reign of terror tomorrow." After Parker left, Sarah turned to Rebecca with concern. "You're worried about him." "Of course I am. These men have already taken everything from him once. I couldn't bear it if—" She couldn't finish the thought. Sarah embraced her cousin comfortingly. "From what you've told me, Forrest Xanders is not a man easily defeated. He'll come back to you." Rebecca wished she could share Sarah's confidence, but the memory of the raid that had nearly taken her life was still too vivid, the brutality of the Blackwell Gang too well known. All she could do was pray that Forrest's experience and skill would be enough to keep him safe in the coming confrontation. Dawn broke clear and cool over Empire City, the rising sun painting the mountains in hues of gold and pink. It seemed wrong that such a beautiful day should bring the threat of violence and death, but nature had never concerned itself with human conflicts. From the window of Sarah's house, Rebecca watched as businesses opened more cautiously than usual, the town's residents moving with an air of nervous anticipation. Word had spread about the potential threat, and many had chosen to keep their children home from school, the streets noticeably emptier than on previous days. At the bank, she could see armed men positioned strategically Forrest and the other lawmen preparing for what might come. The sight of him, standing tall and vigilant, brought both comfort and renewed anxiety. He looked every inch the lawman he had once been, his badge catching the morning light as he conferred with Marshal Parker. The hours crept by with excruciating slowness. Sarah tried to distract Rebecca with household tasks and conversation, but her attention constantly drifted to the window, scanning the street for any sign of approaching danger. It was just past noon when the first shots were fired. The initial volley came from the direction of the livery stable at the edge of town, a diversion, Rebecca realized immediately, designed to draw attention away from the bank. More gunfire erupted moments later, closer to the center of town, followed by shouts and the sound of galloping horses. Sarah quickly closed and locked the front door, then drew Rebecca away from the windows. "We should move to the back of the house," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the circumstances. Rebecca nodded, but her heart was with Forrest, out there in the chaos that was rapidly engulfing the main street. Through the back window, she could see people running for cover, mothers clutching children, shopkeepers abandoning their businesses to seek safety. The gunfire intensified, punctuated by the crash of breaking glass and splintering wood. From their position, they couldn't see the bank, but the concentration of noise suggested that was where the main battle was being waged. "They're putting up a good fight," Sarah observed, her face pale but composed. Rebecca paced the small kitchen, unable to remain still. "I should be doing something, helping somehow." "You promised Forrest you'd stay inside," Sarah reminded her. "The best help you can give right now is to keep that promise." Another volley of shots rang out, followed by a momentary lull. Then, alarmingly, the sound of galloping horses approached their street. "They're spreading through town," Rebecca said, moving cautiously to peek through the curtains. What she saw made her blood run cold. 3 riders were moving down their street, firing indiscriminately at houses and storefronts. They wore bandanas over their faces, but their ruthless efficiency was unmistakable members of the Blackwell Gang breaking away from the main group to wreak havoc throughout the town. As they drew closer, one of the riders looked directly at the window where Rebecca stood. Despite the bandana, she recognized the eyes cold and merciless, the same eyes that had looked at her before firing the shot that had left her for dead weeks earlier. And in that moment of mutual recognition, Rebecca knew they had been seen. "Get down," she shouted to Sarah, dropping to the floor just as bullets shattered the window, sending glass fragments raining across the room. Sarah screamed, diving for cover behind the heavy oak table as more shots splintered the doorframe and embedded themselves in the far wall. "They know I'm here," Rebecca said, her voice tight with fear. "They've seen me." Outside, they heard the riders dismounting, boots thudding on the porch steps. The door rattled violently as someone tried to force it open. "Back door," Sarah whispered urgently. "Quickly." They scrambled to their feet and ran for the kitchen door, but before they could reach it, the front door splintered inward with a deafening crash. 2 men burst into the house, guns drawn, faces concealed by bandanas. "Well, well," one of them drawled, his eyes fixed on Rebecca. "Look who's still alive. Thought I killed you back at that settlement." Rebecca pushed Sarah behind her protectively. "You failed," she said, summoning courage she didn't feel. "Just like you're going to fail today." The outlaw laughed, the sound chilling in its lack of humanity. "Brave talk from a dead woman." He raised his gun. "Won't make that mistake twice." What happened next occurred so rapidly that Rebecca would later struggle to recall the precise sequence. The back door burst open and Forrest appeared, his gun already drawn and firing. The first outlaw went down immediately, a bullet striking him center mass. The second outlaw turned with surprising speed, getting off a shot that grazed Forrest's left arm before Forrest's return fire caught him in the chest, sending him crashing into the wall. Rebecca. Forrest called urgently, his eyes scanning for injuries. "Are you hurt?" "Sarah, we're unharmed," Rebecca assured him, rushing to his side. "But you're bleeding." "Just a graze," he said dismissively, though the blood was soaking through his sleeve. There was a third rider, where the question was answered by more gunfire from outside, a bullet splintering the door frame inches from where they stood. Forrest pushed Rebecca and Sarah toward the relative safety of the kitchen, positioning himself between them and the threat. "Stay down," he ordered, moving to the window to assess the situation. The third outlaw had taken cover behind a water trough across the street, his position giving him a clear line of fire to the house. As Forrest watched, the man fired again, the bullet embedding itself in the wall near the window. "He's pinned us down," Forrest said grimly, "waiting for reinforcements, most likely." "What about Marshal Parker?" "The other deputies?" Sarah asked, engaged at the bank. "The main force hit there, just as we expected." Forrest's expression was one of controlled fury. This was a secondary strike aimed specifically at. He glanced at Rebecca, not needing to complete the thought. "At me," she finished for him. "They knew I was here, that I could identify them." Forrest nodded, "Which means they've been watching, planning." He moved to check the fallen outlaws, confirming they were dead and retrieving their weapons. "We need to move, it's not safe here." "Where can we go?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite her evident fear. "Back of the house, through the gardens. There's an alley that leads to the church. Stone walls, defensible position." Forrest handed one of the retrieved revolvers to Rebecca. "You remember how to use this?" Rebecca nodded, recalling the lessons he had given her during her recovery at his cabin. The weight of the gun was unfamiliar but not unwelcome under the circumstances. "Stay close. Move fast. Don't stop for anything." Forrest looked at both women intently. "Ready," they nodded in unison, gathering their courage for what lay ahead. Forrest led them through the kitchen to the back door, pausing to check the yard before motioning them forward. They moved swiftly across the small garden to the rear fence, Forrest helping them over before following with a fluid grace that belied his injured arm. The alley beyond was narrow and shadowed, running between the backs of houses and businesses. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the church when a shout from behind signaled they had been discovered. "Run!" Forrest commanded, turning to provide covering fire as Rebecca and Sarah sprinted ahead. The church came into view, its stone walls and bell tower standing solid against the chaos engulfing the town. As they approached, the door opened, and another deputy, a young man Rebecca recognized from the marshal's office, waved them inside. "Xanders, in here." They made it through the door just as more gunfire erupted behind them, bullets striking the stone with sharp cracks. The deputy, whose name badge identified him as Collins, quickly barred the door behind them. "Marshall sent me to establish a safe point here," he explained. "Got about a dozen townspeople in the basement. What's the situation out there?" "Bank's still the main target," Forrest replied, checking his ammunition. "But they've branched out through town. At least 3 now, 2 specifically targeting Miss Foster." Collins looked at Rebecca curiously, but didn't ask for details. "Marshall's holding the bank with Johnson and some armed citizens. Last I heard, they'd taken down 4 of the gang, but the leader and at least 3 others were still fighting." Forrest's expression hardened at the mention of the leader. "Blackwell himself is here," Collins nodded. Recognized him from the wanted posters, mean-looking fellow with a scar across his right cheek. A distant explosion shook the church, dust raining down from the rafters. "What was that?" Sarah gasped. "Dynamite," Forrest said grimly. "They're getting desperate." He moved to one of the high windows, carefully peering out at the town beyond. Smoke was rising from the direction of the bank, and the gunfire had intensified. "Collins, get these ladies to the basement with the others. I need to get back out there." "Forrest, no." Rebecca protested, grabbing his arm. "You're injured and they're using explosives now." "Which is exactly why I need to go," he replied, his voice gentler than his words. "Parker needs every gun he can get, especially one that knows Blackwell's tactics." Rebecca knew arguing was futile. This was who Forrest was, a man who would always move toward danger if it meant protecting others. It was one of the reasons she had fallen in love with him, even as it terrified her now. "Then I'm going with you," she said firmly. "Rebecca, I can help. I'm a good shot now, thanks to your teaching, and I have as much reason to want the Blackwell Gang brought to justice as anyone." Forrest looked like he wanted to argue, but another explosion, closer this time, made the decision for them. "Stay behind me," he finally conceded. "Do exactly as I say when I say it." Sarah moved to embrace Rebecca. "Be careful," she whispered. "Both of you come back safely," with Collins leading the remaining townspeople to the relative safety of the church basement. Forrest and Rebecca prepared to rejoin the battle. They exited through a side door, moving cautiously through the cemetery that adjoined the church grounds, using the headstones and monuments as cover. The main street was a scene of chaos and destruction. Several buildings were burning, and the air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. From their position, they could see the bank, its facade pockmarked with bullet holes, windows shattered but still standing. Armed men were positioned at strategic points around it, exchanging fire with unseen assailants. "There's Parker," Forrest said, pointing to a figure crouched behind an overturned wagon near the bank entrance. "We need to reach him without being seen. Stay low, move when I move." They made their way from cover to cover, darting across open spaces when the gunfire temporarily lessened, gradually working their way toward the marshal's position. They had almost reached him when a bullet struck the ground inches from Rebecca's foot, sending up a spray of dirt and gravel. "Down!" Forrest shouted, pulling her behind the burnt-out shell of a delivery wagon as more shots followed. From their new vantage point, Rebecca could see the shooter, a tall man with a distinctive scar across his cheek, positioned on the balcony of the saloon across from the bank. "Blackwell," she whispered, recognizing the description Collins had given. Forrest nodded, his eyes never leaving the outlaw leader. "The man responsible for all of this, for Anna and our child, for what happened to you." The intensity in his voice alarmed Rebecca. "Forrest, don't do anything rash." But he was already calculating, his eyes measuring the distance to the saloon, mapping potential paths of approach. Before he could act, however, Marshal Parker spotted them and signaled urgently. Using the ongoing gunfire as cover, they made a final dash to the marshal's position behind the wagon. "Xanders, glad you made it," Parker greeted, his face streaked with sweat and gunpowder residue. His left arm was bandaged, but he seemed otherwise unharmed. "Miss Foster, you shouldn't be here." "She insisted," Forrest replied before Rebecca could speak. "What's the situation?" "We've got 4 of them down, including the ones at Miss Sarah's house. 3 more pinned down inside the bank with hostages, tellers, and customers, and Blackwell up there directing it all." Parker grimaced. "They got into the vault before we could stop them. Now they're demanding free passage out of town or they'll kill the hostages." "How many hostages?" Forrest asked. "5 that we know of. Two tellers, bank manager, and a couple who were making a deposit when it all started. Forrest's mind was working rapidly, assessing options and risks. Blackwell's the key. Cut off the head and the rest will fall apart. Easier said than done, Parker replied. He's got a clear view of most approaches to the saloon. Not all of them, Forrest said, his eyes moving to the alley that ran behind the buildings. If I can get behind the saloon, come up through the back stairs. Parker nodded slowly. Might work, but it's still a hell of a risk. I'll go with you, Rebecca said immediately. Both men turned to look at her with identical expressions of incredulity. Absolutely not, Forrest stated flatly. Hear me out, Rebecca insisted. A lone man sneaking around will draw attention, but a couple, we could appear to be civilians seeking shelter, draw less suspicion. Forrest looked like he wanted to refuse outright, but Parker was considering the idea with grudging respect. She has a point, Xanders. Two of my deputies tried to approach separately and were spotted immediately. A different approach might be what we need. Forrest's jaw tightened, but he recognized the tactical advantage Rebecca's suggestion offered. Fine. But at the first sign of trouble, you find cover and stay there. Understood. Rebecca nodded, relief and determination mingling in her expression. They waited for a lull in the gunfire, then slipped away from the wagon, moving casually but quickly toward the alley Parker had indicated would lead them behind the row of buildings, including the saloon. The alley was narrow and littered with debris, but mercifully empty of outlaws. They moved silently, staying close to the buildings, alert for any sign of detection. When they reached the back of the saloon, they found a rickety staircase leading to the second floor where the rooms were located, including the one with the balcony where Blackwell had positioned himself. Stay behind me, Forrest whispered, drawing his gun as they began to ascend the stairs, wincing slightly as his injured arm took some of his weight on the railing. The door at the top was unlocked. Blackwell, evidently confident in his security, with all the attention focused on the front of the building. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a dimly lit hallway lined with doors to the various rooms. From the front of the building, they could hear Blackwell shouting orders, his voice harsh and commanding. Forrest signaled for Rebecca to stay close to the wall as they crept forward, approaching the room from which the voice emanated. The door was partially open, allowing them to see Blackwell standing at the balcony railing, a rifle in his hands as he fired periodically at the lawmen below. His back was to them, attention focused entirely on the street. Forrest took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. This was the moment he had been working toward for 3 years, face to face with the man responsible for destroying his life, and so many others. With a quick nod to Rebecca, indicating she should stay where she was, Forrest pushed the door open wider and stepped into the room, his gun leveled at Blackwell's back. "Drop the rifle, Blackwell," he commanded, his voice steady and cold. "It's over." The outlaw leader froze, then slowly turned, his scarred face twisting into a sneer when he saw Forrest. "Well, if it isn't the marshal from Denver. Heard you quit after what happened to your pretty wife." His eyes gleamed with malicious pleasure. "Shame about that. She was a real beauty." Forrest's finger tightened on the trigger, but he held himself in check. "Drop the rifle. Now." Blackwell laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Or what? You'll shoot me. Go ahead. My men will kill every hostage in that bank if I don't return. Your men are surrounded, cut off from escape. Surrender now, and I'll make sure you get a fair trial." "A fair trial," Blackwell spat. "We both know there's only one way this ends for me, so why don't we make it interesting?" His eyes shifted suddenly, looking past Forrest to where Rebecca stood in the hallway. "Bring your little girlfriend in here. Let her watch what happens when people cross the Blackwell Gang." Forrest's heart clenched with fear, but before he could respond, Rebecca stepped into the room. The revolver Forrest had given her held steadily in both hands. "I've seen what your gang does," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "I survived it once. I don't intend to give you a second chance." Blackwell's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Well, well, the schoolteacher from the settlement. You're harder to kill than I thought." "Drop the rifle," Forrest repeated, taking a step closer. "Last chance." For a moment it seemed Blackwell might comply. Then, with a movement too quick to anticipate, he swung the rifle toward Rebecca. Forrest fired without hesitation, his bullet striking Blackwell in the chest at the same moment that Rebecca's shot hit the outlaw in the shoulder. The combined impact sent him stumbling backward, crashing through the balcony railing to fall to the street below. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. Forrest rushed to the broken railing, looking down to see Blackwell's motionless form sprawled in the dust of the main street. Marshal Parker and several townspeople were already converging on the body, weapons ready. "Is he?" Rebecca asked, moving to stand beside Forrest. "Yes," Forrest confirmed, holstering his gun. "It's done." The words should have brought relief, a sense of justice finally served. Instead, Forrest felt oddly hollow, as if the purpose that had driven him for so long had evaporated like morning mist. Then Rebecca's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his own, and the emptiness began to recede, replaced by something he had not dared to hope for since that terrible night 3 years ago, a future. "Let's go help Parker with the hostages," he said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "There's still work to be done." With Blackwell dead, the remaining outlaws in the bank surrendered quickly, releasing the hostages unharmed. The battle for Empire City was over, but the work of recovery was just beginning. Buildings needed repair, wounds needed tending, and the dead, both outlaws and several unfortunate townspeople caught in the crossfire, needed burying. Through it all, Forrest and Rebecca worked side by side, their shared ordeal cementing a bond that had been forming since that first moment when he had found her barely breathing in the aftermath of violence. A week after the raid, with the town beginning to return to something resembling normalcy, Forrest found Rebecca at the schoolhouse, helping Sarah prepare for the return of students. The simple domestic scene struck him anew with its rightness, with the possibility it represented. "Got a minute?" he asked from the doorway. Rebecca looked up, her face brightening at the sight of him. "Of course." Sarah tactfully excused herself, leaving them alone among the small desks and educational charts. "How's the arm?" Rebecca asked, nodding toward the bandage still visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "Healing well. Doc says I'll have full use of it in another week or so." Forrest moved closer, suddenly finding it difficult to say what he had come to say. "Parker's offered me a permanent position. Full deputy marshal for Empire City." Rebecca's smile was radiant. "That's wonderful. Are you going to accept?" Thinking about it, Forrest's gaze was steady on hers. "Depends on a few things. Such as whether there's reason enough to put down roots here. To build something that lasts." He took a deep breath. "Rebecca, I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures, but these past weeks with you, they've reminded me that there's more to life than survival, more than vengeance or duty." Rebecca's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she stepped closer to him. "And what might that be, Deputy Xanders?" "Love," he said simply. "A partnership, like you said, a chance to build something new from the ashes." His hand reached for hers, calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "I can't promise it will be easy. I'm still learning how to live again, not just survive. But if you're willing to be patient with me—" "Patience is a virtue I can manage," Rebecca quoted herself, her voice thick with emotion. "Especially for the right cause." Forrest smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his features and reached his eyes, erasing years of solitude and grief. "Is that a yes, Miss Foster?" In answer, Rebecca rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that held all the promise of their shared future, one built on the foundation of that moment, when he had found her barely breathing, and decided that was enough reason to hope. 8 months later, on a perfect spring day with the mountains still capped with snow but wildflowers beginning to dot the valleys, Rebecca Foster became Rebecca Xanders in a ceremony at the newly repaired church of Empire City. The entire town turned out for the occasion, Marshall Parker standing as Forrest's best man, Sarah as Rebecca's maid of honor. The couple had already purchased land on the outskirts of town, where Forrest was building a house with his own hands, larger and more comfortable than his mountain cabin, but with the same solid craftsmanship and attention to detail. It would be ready by summer, in time for the beginning of the school year, when Rebecca would join Sarah as the town's second teacher. Empire City was growing rapidly, prosperity fueled by the mines, and the increasing number of families settling in the area. With that growth came challenges, but under Marshall Parker's leadership, with Forrest as his right hand, the town was developing a reputation for being both prosperous and safe, a rare combination in the still wild territory. The Blackwell Gang was no more, its surviving members serving long sentences in territorial prisons. The nightmares that had plagued both Forrest and Rebecca gradually diminished, replaced by dreams of the future they were building together. On their wedding night, as they lay in each other's arms in the small but comfortable room they had rented until their house was complete, Rebecca traced the scar on Forrest's arm, a permanent reminder of the day they had faced down evil together. "You ever think about how unlikely it all was?" she asked softly. "If you hadn't come to that settlement when you did, if I hadn't survived long enough for you to find me." Forrest captured her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I try not to dwell on what might have been, but I do thank God every day that I found you in time." His eyes, once so guarded, now shone with love and contentment. "You're still breathing. That's enough," I told myself, but it was more than enough. It was everything. Rebecca smiled, curling closer to him. "Everything," she agreed. And in the years that followed, through all the joys and challenges that came with building a life in the still untamed West, they held fast to that truth. Their love, born in the aftermath of violence and nurtured through healing and growth, was more than just survival. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of second chances. 4 years after their wedding, the Xanders family welcomed twins, a boy named James and a girl named Anna, named for those they had lost but never forgotten. Later, 2 more children would join their growing family, a son, Michael, and another daughter, Sarah, named after Rebecca's cousin who had become like a sister to her. Forrest eventually became Marshal when Parker moved on to a position with the territorial government, his reputation for fairness and integrity making him respected throughout Colorado. Rebecca's school grew along with the town, eventually requiring a proper schoolhouse with multiple classrooms and teachers. They never forgot how their story began, with a raid, with loss, with a moment when survival seemed unlikely. But they also never lost sight of how it continued, with love, with healing, with the building of something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of what had been destroyed. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep, and they sat together on the porch of the home Forrest had built with his own hands, watching the sun set behind the mountains, they would often hold hands in comfortable silence, each thinking the same thought: "You're still breathing." That's enough. But it had been so much more than enough. It had been the beginning of everything.